Welcome to each of you today as we study and learn together again from the letter to Messianic Jews written sometime after the death and resurrection of Yeshua around AD 30 and before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Even though the book is nearly 2,000 years old, it has a lot to say to us as 21st century Australia and, dare I say, to people around the globe. Today we'll study chapter 2. And if you haven't yet read it, please, those of you on YouTube, please pause the playback, read the chapter, and then press play again to rejoin us. Thanks. Welcome back. This chapter again features several quotes from the Older Testament, as did chapter 1, and continues the theme of Yeshua being better than the angels. And this time it's going to take that further, saying some more clear theology about his person and his actions. The combination both of exhortation along with this explanation is the point of the chapter today. If Yeshua is the Son of God, then we ought to listen to him and obey him. Let's unpack the chapter's 18 verses line by line and see what it has to say to us as 21st century people. If you're new to this form of Bible teaching, we especially welcome you today. The notion of Yeshua as better than the angels is in the logical consideration of the author, and he opens with that. We have to listen to Yeshua so that we will get things right in life, in our contact with others, with the historic Jewish religion, etc. And the author uses a comparative, but it has the meaning of a superlative. That's typical of the time. Pay close attention, he says, or she says. Pay closer attention. Pay the closest attention you can to what Yeshua taught. Otherwise, he says, we might drift. Listening implies compliance, of course, just like the Shema explains. Hearing without doing makes no sense to biblical authors. James 2, Matthew 7. So what does the author want us to hear? The gospel doesn't say that. He or she uses the phrase, what we have heard. Remember, one of the two overarching themes of Hebrews is listen up. Rather than the visible or touchable, like John would call us to, the author wants us to remember what we have heard. Faith comes by hearing, and if we recall or even restate the previously spoken and heard words, our faith will grow. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. But the words God spoke so long ago and now have reissued and reinforced through Yeshua, those are what we should hear. Listen and do. Otherwise, the author says, you will drift. By the way, this is the only time we see this nautical term in the entire Newer Testament, although it's fairly common in secular sources at the time. And this is the first warning of 6 warnings found in this letter. Listen, or you will drift. Lane references this in Proverbs 3, verse 21, in the Septuagint. Remember, that's the Bible translated into the Hebrew, translated into Greek. It says this, that the same word, pararein, signifies to lose sight of advice and wisdom. Lane says, the writer warns his readers that they're in danger of losing sight of the reality of Christian salvation, end quote. See, that's a terrific link with the Older Testament. Drifting away from the primary source is drifting away from God. Not a good thing to do. And obviously, anyone serious about walking with the Lord wouldn't want to do so. So the author is making clear what's wrong with skipping out on some compliance issues. Verse 2, the words spoken through angels, it says. Wait, when did angels give words? Is it in the wrestling with Jacob or the appearance at the oaks of Mamre with our father Abraham? Maybe Gideon's "Hail, valiant warrior" is in view. No, I think it's in the giving of Torah itself, which will come into this letter again and again. Now, the Jewish tradition wins over against the clear record of Exodus 19 and 20. There we don't see any angels giving Torah. But in Deuteronomy 33, there's a hint. We read this: "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones. At his right hand there was flashing lightning for them." The tradition in the Jewish world is that angels were there at Mount Sinai. You see that in Psalm 68. Certainly, that was the understanding in the Maccabean period, and by the time of Stephen's final speech in Acts chapter 7, before his martyrdom, he even cites that angels were there at Sinai. And that's where Paul gets it too in Galatians 3. One of the most used literary devices in this letter, and really throughout the record of the Newer Testament, we saw it in the book of Romans study, is what we call in Hebrew kal vachomer. It's used in Latin in legal terms as an argument a fortiori, meaning from the stronger case. It's a way of saying something like, well, if this is true, then by inference, the larger consideration is true. The old Yiddish one-liner was, if one day with her mother-in-law was too much, kal vachomer, a weekend will be. Verse 3, the author says, if the angelic word was inalterable and carried penalties, how will we escape if we neglect what the Son has said? The greater salvation. Listen, if you get caught behind when you disregard Torah, what do you think is going to happen if you disregard Yeshua? There are harsher penalties for those who know more. A policeman might give you a warning if you're new to lockdown in Victoria, but if you've been caught before and they find a record of a warning in your profile at the police station, be sure you'll be given stricter punishment and harsher penalties. That's what's in view here. Verse 4, God has demonstrated this in giving of Torah with signs and wonders, and now in this new era where the Son of God has spoken, we who've heard it are more responsible for more compliance and more penalties if we break with his plans. See how that works? And what is the substance and subject of the Son's announcements for which we're responsible? The word salvation. If we neglect so great a salvation. It's his very name. Remember, Yeshua means salvation. It's his ministry. It's his longing for each of us to be saved and to live in that salvation with others who share that same faith. Remember, Yeshua told a story or two about a landowner who planted a vineyard and then left others in charge. This is in Matthew 21. When it was time for the collection of the increase of the fruit, he sent servants, but the tenants killed the servants. Beating, killing ensued. Finally, the landowner sent his son, sure that the tenants would respect him. But you might know in the telling of the story, Yeshua highlights the pathos with the tenants killing the son. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard returns, what will he do to those tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end. Kal v'chomer. Verse 5, the world to come. The angels are not held in such responsibility. Only humankind and the consummate human rep, Yeshua himself, can fulfill this message, this passage, as we read in the first Older Testament citation today from Psalm 8. God made us, people, a little lower than angels. The author's argument, and it does sound legal throughout the letter, is that Yeshua is better than angels. Okay, he clarified that in chapter 1. But some people might argue, well, wait a minute. If God made Yeshua lower than the angels for a while in that he became man, then he's lost that privilege forever, and thus angels are the new 2IC in heaven. But the author basically says, no, the time of lowering did not diminish the world to come aspect of the exaltation. And so he calls more Old Testament witnesses to the stand to validate this claim, which will continue throughout the book. There is a world to come, we say in Hebrew, Olam Haba, and that kingdom cannot be shaken. And in that reality of the future, the not yet, for which we long, the city that is to come, Yeshua is ever exalted, and all things, including angels, will be subject to him. COVID-19 will be subject to Yeshua. COVID-20, COVID-86, or those who do harm to others will be subject to him. Blasphemers will be subject to him. Anti-theists will be subject to him. Maybe not today, but in the world to come. That will happen. Verse 5, concerning which we are speaking. Verses 6 and following, Psalm 8 is highlighted. What is man, or the Son of Man? We and he are less, but only for a while. In light of the real eternity, Yeshua's downward steps were not a spiral out of control. They were a careful, methodical, walking point by point, designed to make him human, and a particular human at that. If you have a Bible and you want to look at Philippians 2, verse 5 and following, I'm going to read this a couple times. Philippians 2, 5 and following. It says this, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Messiah Yeshua, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason also, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Yeshua every knee will bow, of those in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Yeshua is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. I'll number these so you can see that there are 7 steps down, followed by 7 steps up. Let me show you that. Have this attitude that was in Yeshua, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but 1, emptied himself. 2, took the form of a bondservant. 3, made in the likeness of men. 4, being found in the appearance as a man. 5, humbled himself by becoming 6, obedient to the point of death. 7, death on a cross. Each one is more particular than the last. Look at the 7 steps up. Verse 9, God, number 1, highly exalted him. 2, bestowed on him the name above every name, so that at the name of Yeshua, 3, every knee will bow. Those, number 4, in heaven. 5, on earth. 6, under the earth. So that 7, every tongue will confess Yeshua is Lord. Those steps he took were well chosen. Kenosis, he emptied himself of all that is divine, all his power. He lost control. He didn't just become a human, but a Jewish human, and a Jewish man under the bondage and subjection of first century Rome. Humility. Then he died, but not just a normal expiration, but he died as a criminal on a Roman cross. He was executed. All of that was to earn him a place which is exalted, and for him to identify with us in our situations of life. Back to Hebrews 2, verse 6. I find it fascinating, and maybe you saw this too, that the author doesn't say, King David wrote. We all know King David wrote Psalm 8. Every good Jew would know that this is a Psalm of David. The superscription, which some of you might skip when you're reading the Bible, is read as part of any psalm that has one. Mizmor LeDavid, a song or psalm of David. It's clear as a clarion, yet the author says, one has testified somewhere. Why do you think that is? Because it's in the Psalter. It's God's word. It's not the human author which matters. It's the divine author. And perhaps it's a way of confirming his or her own authorship of Hebrews as irrelevant, or at least subsidiary to the authorship of God. Verse 8, again highlighting the now and not yet nature of the kingdom of God. All things are subject to the Son of Man, but not yet. Or as Paul said in Philippians, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Yeshua is Lord. But we don't see that yet. Verse 9, the author zooms his camera lens further on Psalm 8, and although the natural reading of it doesn't sound prophetic about a single person, the author makes it such. Yeshua is the one who was, for a little while, lower than angels, and then tasted death, it says, which according to John Wesley is, quote, an expression denoting both the reality of his death and the shortness of its continuance, end quote, and who thus is in view by King David. Verse 12, again the author grabs the psalter and sings out from Psalm 22. The proclamation is in view, and dare I say, it's in earshot, and the word brethren sticks out clearly. When Yeshua is exalted and has all things in control, he will call us brethren. That's pretty great. The point being that in his lowering, in his kenosis, in his becoming human, he personally identified with us, not as a duty, but in the sense of family. This point will come out more clearly in the high priest Melchizedek section in just a couple chapters. We are Yeshua's brothers and sisters. How awesome is that? Then the second and third quotes are taken back to back from Isaiah chapter 8, verses 18, then 17. Don't ask. Actually, I'm not sure why the author uses the conjunction and to separate them, but it's likely, according to many sources, that the poetry we read here in these verses was part of an early believer's hymn that was sung as early as the 2nd century. Why did Yeshua become less than the angels for a time? Verse 14, himself likewise also partook of the same, as we have stated. And what's the point of all this? Yeshua versus the angels imagery and the humiliation of the Messiah. It's found in verse 18. Since he himself was tempted in that which he suffered, he's able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. Friends, he calls us brethren, he calls us family, and he's not ashamed so to do. Maybe you've heard the imagery of God being like us. Bear with me, please. If I wanted to communicate my love to, say, a colony of ants as they march from the creek through Lane Cove up the hill to their next locale, how would I communicate to them? Should I buy advertisements and place them on the side of the path like billboards? Should I invest in some translation box and send messages in my voice through the little boxes to the little ants? The best way to communicate is for me to become an ant, if that's possible, then to walk along in the journey from the creek with them. It's in the becoming like them that I can best share in their life and communicate my message. That's what the author is saying Yeshua did. He who was exalted humbled himself and is not ashamed to call us sisters and brothers. That through his death, verse 14, he might render powerless the devil, who previously had the power of death. Look at verse 15. The devil works through the fear of death, subjecting people to slavery. We certainly are seeing some of that with mental responses to COVID-19 and the hundreds of thousands of deaths worldwide. Even here in Australia, we're seeing a slight increase in the cases and in the deaths of our countrymen, and fear of death is growing. But Yeshua wants us to receive his aid, that's verse 18, and no longer be slaves to the fear of death. He wants you to be free from the fear of death. Dear friends on Zoom or on YouTube, if you don't yet know Messiah Yeshua, please, I appeal to you today, surrender your life to him. Admit your need of him. Trust him, who came from heaven to earth to show the way and to set you free. If you want to talk more about that, start with prayer. Talk to the Almighty. He loves to listen to your faintest whisper. And if you want to ask me a question, just use the email here on the screen. I'll give it a go to try to answer you. Until next week, when we will meet again to share about chapter 3 and Sabbath rest and the contrast of Yeshua with Moshe Rabbeinu. Until then, Shabbat Shalom.